On a happier note, though, I would like to thank Roger very much for the chance to speak about modern China today. Also, Sheila and all the team who I know have been working behind the scenes to make this event happening, not just in terms of, I hope, the relatively easy part of getting me to come over from Oxford, but also, of course, all of the arrangements that have become so laborious, things that we used to think of as very kind of straightforward in the before times, as they say. And I'm very conscious of how much effort has gone into making this event happen. And indeed, to have so many of you here this evening in what looks almost like a normally packed auditorium until you look at the seats in between. I have to say, I don't think I've seen this many people this spaced out since the last time I was at Glastonbury, but that was a slightly different sort of context. And if I may thank a few of the people who had the misfortune to teach me in the past, Richard Bowring, Hans van der Ven, and Susan here as well, and also friends and colleagues from Cambridge. Great to see Barak and Mami here, and also Paul Cartledge, my old teacher, Richard Bowring, as I've said, and also a junior member of the Mitter family over in the corner, just to keep an eye on what I'm up to. So the title that I have probably rather optimistically given for this talk is Where China Goes Next. And I'm reminded of a conversation I had a few years ago with a colleague who is himself a Chinese citizen, but was teaching at Oxford for a while. This is a little while ago now. And I was asking him some questions about sort of political economy of China and where he thought China would be in about 5 years' time at that stage. And he suddenly got a bit impatient after a while. We were in a pub, I think, in fact. And he said, Rana, I don't know why you're asking me all these detailed questions, because I can tell you, in 5 years from now, China will rule the world. And I thought, wow, that's a big statement. Then I suddenly thought, and I said, hang on. I remember I first met you about 10 years ago in China, I think. And you told me then that in 5 years from then, China would rule the world. And he said, oh, yeah, I do remember I met you in Beijing that time. I do remember I said that to you. But the difference is that this time I am right. So I can't absolutely guarantee that everything I say this evening will be right, although we'll be delighted to be taken up on it in 5, 10, or 20 years. But I do think that we can spend some time this evening talking about what I think is important to understand about contemporary China. And to do that, I'm going to divide what I have to say into several sections, none of them excessively long, I hasten to add, but nonetheless, I think pointing to the different elements that I think make up what we need to understand in the West about the China of today, where it's come from, and where it's going to. And one of the reasons that I think we should do that is that we find ourselves sometimes taking moments in time, snapshots from the news, and finding ourselves not necessarily able to extrapolate the background and, I think, the complexities that surround things that briefly illuminate our news cycles and then fade away. And no disrespect to a distinguished head of BBC television news in the past here when I say that. This particular image of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, general secretary of the Communist Party, at the Davos conference, a virtual conference, of course, this year, back in January, in some senses illustrates the two sides of what China is doing today. Because you see there are two pictures of Xi Jinping there. The lower one is what you might call global Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping speaking at the perhaps premier gathering of the global elites, the World Economic Forum at Davos. The top image is, of course, the same man, but as you might be able to tell from the blurred background, he is speaking, of course, in the context of a very Chinese event, the 19th Party Congress, 2017, at which he articulated a set of views about, to put it at its most basic, what China will do next and why it was going to do that. And understanding not just the two Xi Jinpings, but actually, I think, the two different sides of China, the global, but also the ideological, and these are not necessarily oppositional categories, but they have to, I think, be understood in tandem, is, I think, part of the key to deepening our own understanding of what it is that China wants to do in the world. And to do that in a bit more detail today, I'm going to offer two grids, if I may. I know that it is a tick of management consultants to come to meetings and to lovely auditoria like these and give you 3 points. But just to make the point on this occasion, I'm not going to swallow the McKinsey bug. I'm going to give you 4 points in each case, just to vary the model. And in this particular first case, I want to put forward briefly a model. I've written about this actually in more details in the journal Foreign Affairs, and if anyone is moved to do so, you're welcome to read an expanded version of this idea here. But I found it a very useful mnemonic, a very useful way of trying to understand something about why I think we, meaning the Western world, often fail to understand today's China. And the way I put it is that to understand the DNA of China, there are these four factors, and briefly I want to address them to explain why I think they work together. And the use of the DNA idea is not just simply meant to be a kind of handy cliche, because we say that everything has a DNA these days, even if they're not animate in any sense. It's because the biologists and even non-biologists amongst you will be aware that the four nucleotides that make up actual DNA have the initials ACGT, and in this particular case it seems to me the factors that make up today's China, coincidentally, also have the same initials. A unique combination of an authoritarian style of government, a consumerist economy and political economy, a globalization or at least global ambition, and perhaps the most transformative factor in recent years, the growth of innovation in technology. And as with real DNA, just putting together a bunch of nucleotides in a jar doesn't get you life. It has to recombine in all sorts of ways that are much more than the sum of the parts. So I think understanding what contemporary China is, and not just the China of Xi Jinping himself, but actually the wider nexus that has formed around him and will continue, I suspect, even after he has stepped down as Chinese leader, I think draws on these four strands. Because China's authoritarianism, if we want to call it that, is, I think, for the first time, certainly in recent years, one that is very unembarrassed about putting forward the idea that a non-democratic, non-liberal mode of governance is not something that China needs to sort of shuffle its feet and be embarrassed about, but actually, at least in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, is a positive good in and of itself. There are historians, including, I suspect, some sitting in this room, who would point out that actually that strand has always been strong in Chinese thinking, but it hasn't always been as obvious, at least to the rest of the world, as it is now. The second factor speaks to a great failure of the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union tried to create a consumer lifestyle for its population to match the Western world. It rarely succeeded in doing so, as the kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon back in the Cold War showed rather effectively. Today, there are many things, accusations that one can make against today's China, but the idea that it is not creating for hundreds of millions of its citizens an aspirational middle-class lifestyle, along with both the pluses of that, including leisure breaks, holidays, high-quality smartphones, and on the downside, of course, the prospect of having to spend most of your income paying for mortgages on those skyscraper flats that we see in all the major cities. All of that is very much something that is familiar to the Chinese middle class today. Globalization and global ambition, because certainly in the last decade or so, China has rethought the way in which it seeks to engage with the world. And again, particularly since that 2017 speech to the party Congress, Xi Jinping, I think, has been again unashamed and I think unembarrassed about the fact that China is certainly seeking to have a global footprint, although how that is defined is still very much a work in progress. And I'll say some more about that in just a few minutes. And then fourth, I think it is worth noting that the growth of Chinese innovation in technology is clearly one of the areas where it is most transformative, not just to itself, and we should just remember that itself means a quarter of the world's population, and therefore even China's domestic changes are no trivial matter for the rest of the world, but also beyond that, the idea that actually Chinese technology has applications, uses, and for many people, grave concerns in many parts of the world which are a very long way from China's heartland territory. So, as I say, these factors coming together and reflecting off each other in a variety of ways, I think is what makes the current Chinese governance settlement, if we want to put it that way, both unique and also very protean, very changeable, and also I think the key to understanding where it is going to go in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and beyond. The other grid that I want to offer you is a brief thought about the sources of conduct. And I'm being slightly mischievous there since many of you will recognize the reference to George Kennan's famous X-telegram back in the early Cold War when he talked about the sources of Soviet conduct. And he himself obviously put forward a really quite hostile model of what became an incipient Cold War at that stage between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. Whether or not the West is in a classic Cold War with China is, I think, highly debatable in all sorts of ways. But nonetheless, it is clearly the case that there is, I think, a lack of deep understanding about many of the key factors that go to shape up the mindset that shapes Chinese policy choices in the present day. And while this is by no means a comprehensive list, all four of them, again, I think, have some purchase in terms of the set of thoughts that are going through the minds not just of top-level policymakers and high leaders, but also that constituent, emergent, wired, online middle class who has access to social media, who helps to shape public opinion in China, and yes, there is very much such a thing, and draws on a variety of factors, some of which are, I think, not familiar in the liberal world to do it. The first one, and this is one that I'll come back to in a little more detail in one aspect in just a moment or so, is modern history. Modern history in China, it could be defined in a variety of ways, but let's say from the mid-19th century, the period of the first Western imperialist incursions against China, has a whole variety of lessons that continue to shape China's leadership elites, from the disasters of the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, the arrival of gunships, opium, and Christianity, not necessarily in that order, but nonetheless closely related as a means of changing China forever, to the, in some ways, more positive, but also in many ways quite nationalistic stories told about China's experience in the Second World War. The second factor I'd give you is perhaps the one that is best known, but as I say, needs to be understood, I think, in a matrix rather than as being separated, and that is the idea of economic performance legitimacy. It is indisputable, but that for the vast majority of people in the last 40 years or so within China, their per capita income, their lifestyles have changed and improved in all sorts of important ways. That is, of course, for the average citizen. We can think of all sorts of exceptions, and I will mention some of those in just a moment. But in terms of the overall narrative, the story that the Chinese Communist Party has created an economic model which has increased the standards of living of most Chinese people is a powerful tool in their hands. The third factor, and one that perhaps has been underplayed until recently, but I think is very real, is a highly adapted, but nonetheless, I think, quite deeply felt belief in the revival and reinvention of traditional Chinese thought. This is sometimes reduced to the term Confucianism, a term which Asia specialists in the room will probably shudder at on the grounds that it conceals much more than it necessarily explains, but nonetheless drawing on pre-modern streams of Chinese philosophy, ethics, and governance, and reinventing terms like ren, benevolence, or yi, righteousness, as a way of understanding China's behavior in the world today. This may seem like an oddity for a state run by the world's largest communist party. In some ways, frankly, it is an oddity for a state run by the world's largest communist party. But there is no doubt that whether it is the current Xi Jinping government's continued adherence to terms such as Chinese wisdom, which is actually used often as a code for a sort of modernized and somewhat simplified version of Confucian thinking, to the fact that significant Chinese scholars working on contemporary problems of international relations, social hierarchy, and so forth, regularly draw on Chinese philosophical thinking. And I'm thinking here of writers like Yan Xuetong, Bai Tongdong, and others in China's universities. There is no doubt that knowing about China's pre-modern thinking matters in today's governance in a way that perhaps was less true a generation ago. But that generation reminds me that it is worth also noting that sometimes when people tell you things about themselves, you should believe them. And when the Chinese Communist Party says, as it says over and over again, that it is a Marxist-Leninist party, I think that that is a claim that is very well worth believing, not least because many of the people who essentially inform China's ideological shaping in the present day. We might think of Politburo Standing Committee member Wang Huning, but there are plenty of others working under him who I suspect do an awful lot of the writing and thinking and turn up in vehicles such as the major theoretical journal of the Chinese Communist Party, Qiu Shi. These are places where Marxist-Leninist theory, or Marxism and Marxism-Leninism, which are not, of course, the same thing, but closely related in terms of their use and operation in governance, are taken immensely seriously. And even at a very superficial level, the use of repeated terms in the five-year plan and elsewhere, such as Maodun, contradiction, or dozheng, struggle, are ones that any Hegelian would see the relevance of, even if they're clearly being adapted to very contemporary issues, such as the contradiction between creating strong growth and green growth in the economy. The difference is that because, and this is my surmise, but I think it's a defensible one, because it is much more attractive to China's vision of itself to the outside world to stress the harmonious Confucian elements, that is what tends to appear in most of China's international self-presentation. But the Marxist-Leninist part is by no means hidden. It's mostly in Chinese rather than in English, but it's very much visible on everywhere from the front page of the People's Daily. And both of these elements, again a contradiction in themselves, are very much part of that grid that brings together different forms of thought to shape today's today's China and its ideas of governance. The one factor that you will see is not there, the missing fifth bullet, which is perhaps slightly different from the fifth modernization of the 1970s that Chinese specialists will know about, but not so far, is liberalism, a strand of thought which still sits very much at the basis of much of what the rest of the world, at least the democratic world, chooses to think about as normal in governance. And while it is by no means absent, particularly amongst Chinese intellectuals, it is not, I think it's fair to say, a powerful or normative section of the way in which today's China seeks to think about the dilemmas that face it. So, two sets of thoughts there, if I may, to lay out the grid before I get to some of the details of the ways in which I think today's China is grappling with these questions of what it is, where it's going, and how it's going to get there. So let me turn to the next slide. Actually, let me just grab a glass as well. I don't want to spend too much time going through a sort of shopping list or checklist of all of the major factors that shape today's China, not least because there are so many of them that we would clearly be here a very, very long time. I think Xi Jinping managed 3.5 hours for his speech to the last party congress, but I suspect that the master might get a little antsy if I start trying to exercise my rights in those particular terms. But I don't think it should necessarily be necessary anyway, because some of the key things that have shaped the era of the current Chinese leadership, certainly since 2012, don't take anything like even 3.5 minutes to point out. One is the level of centralization. Broadly speaking, although, of course, China's Communist Party has had a leadership role ever since 1949, the way in which both its individual leaders and the party system as a whole has exercised that leadership has changed very substantially over that time, from sort of Soviet-style command and control, the Cultural Revolution and near anarchy at times, the kind of market experimentation combined with top-down political control of the reform and Deng Xiaoping era, and variations in between. And one might say that one of the things that has characterized Xi Jinping's period in power is both the re-stressing of the importance of the party as opposed to the government, which perhaps had swung a little bit in the other direction under his two predecessors, but also beyond that, the idea that actually placing control under one central body and authority and indeed person was a useful and necessary way to pursue a variety of wider political goals. And one of the most important occasions for the justification of that centralization over much of the last decade or so has been the anti-corruption drive. It is no accident that very early on, Xi Jinping chose to make anti-corruption the public face of his administration, and second, that he went for one of the most powerful silos, if you might say, within the system itself, the military, taking on Xu Caihou, at that point recently retired senior figure in the Chinese military leadership, who in fact died of cancer before he could be brought to prosecution, but nonetheless in a very public way was made an example of as a first step in what then became a much more widespread anti-corruption campaign that then formulated itself into a new institution of government, the Central Discipline and Inspection Commission, which still is very much at the centre of governance today. The message was, of course, about anti-corruption, but it was also very much about positioning Xi Jinping as a figure who had the people's good at his heart, that he was looking to sort of push back against corrupt elites and instead be a kind of leading figure who would find himself actually going back to real heartland values that the Chinese Communist Party had once stood for, perhaps even back in the days of Mao Zedong. And one of the best illustrations of this, and some of you may even have seen this, and if not, you should check out YouTube, was the television show from, I think, 2017 or 18, In the Name of the People, which was a big blockbuster hit on Chinese television, consisting of basically a fictionalized group of untouchables, anti-corruption inspectors. I think the first scene of the first episode, I'm sorry if the camera can't get this, involved basically someone's door being kicked down by the inspector sort of smashing against the door, and inside there's, this portly middle-aged official lying down while his mistress in her underwear is sort of, screaming, and all of this sort of brandy and renminbi notes all over the place. In other words, it wasn't a very subtle drama, but the Chinese propaganda authorities felt confident enough about the way in which their anti-corruption message was going down in wider society to make a big blockbuster hit, which was then, as I say, probably the biggest hit on Chinese TV during that particular year. They were able to do that in part because of the other factor that I've mentioned here, which was a much greater use, even than before, of ideas of nationalism. And I want to use this term quite carefully, because it can be the case, and sometimes it is justifiable, to be fair, that the term nationalism is used in the Chinese context purely to mean xenophobia or anti-foreignism. And, let's not mess around. Those terms are sometimes accurate descriptions of the way in which both official China and Chinese social media react to things happening in the outside world, and it's often a very unattractive prospect. However, it is also worth noting that nationalism in a wider sense, the desire for a sovereign nation state, the desire for a kind of solid, ordered society in which to live and thrive and coexist, and all of those things, which actually are mainstays of nationalisms everywhere around the world, are not so alien from the Chinese experience either. And both of those elements, I think, can be found, both the more confrontational and unpleasant ones, but also the ones that are actually more natural in terms of the ever ongoing project that is the formation of modern China. It is still a process that has by no means ended at this point. And I want to spend a few minutes now, if I may, illustrating one particular example of how this nationalism is formed. It's going to be drawn from a subject on which I've been mildly obsessed for probably far too many decades, the experience of China during the Second World War period, but I can at least blame a member of the audience for this, having been supervised for my PhD by Professor Hans van der Ven, who I suspect may have laid some seeds in that direction in the past. And the aspect that I want to talk about is primarily the way in which, certainly in the last 30 to 40 years, the reform era, as it's known in China, but with a particular, I think, enthusiasm in the past couple of decades or so, the subject of World War II has returned to China as part of the popular culture, the political culture, the way of thinking about national identity. To do this, I have to give a very brief summary for perhaps a very small number of people in the audience or watching who don't know much about China's experience in World War II. And I should say for those who do not, I would highly recommend Hans's recent book, China at War, which actually gives you, I think, 3 wars for the value of 1 volume, going between the war with Japan, the Chinese Civil War, and the Korean War. So it's a really exciting and illustrative read about some conflicts that are very much understudied in the Western world. But I bring that to mind here partly because the World War II experience in particular, dated by most Western historians between 1937 and 1945, a longer period of war, certainly than the European theatre. The Chinese themselves officially now date it from the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, but that's a historiographical and political debate we won't get into at this point. Even with those 8 years, I mean, statistics are hard to come by, but the best statistics we have suggest that 8, 10 or more million Chinese civilians and military were killed during those years, either in direct combat or in many other cases through horrific events like famine, through disease that was caused through the destruction of dikes that held water back, through mass spread of other infections, bacteriological warfare, a whole variety of different and horrific factors during those years. In addition, it's worth noting that something like 80 to 100 million Chinese are thought to have become refugees during that period in their own country. The infrastructure of railways, roads, and other aspects of modernity, built painfully and often in very flawed ways by China's then government, were mostly bombed or smashed to pieces. And not incidentally, regardless of what else you may think about them, both China's communists and nationalists, the Kuomintang, continued to fight against the Japanese for 4.5 years until the Western world at Pearl Harbor, the United States, and the British Empire were brought into what became the global theatre of World War II. So this was a conflict of immense significance to the world, but certainly of immense significance to China. And to some extent, it's unsurprising that it should be so important in their thinking about nationhood today. And yet, one important aspect of that history was actually not talked about very much for certainly the years that Chairman Mao was ruler of China, from the late 1940s up to the mid-1970s to late 1970s. And that was the contribution not of the Chinese Communist Party, but of their old opponents in the Civil War, the Kuomintang nationalists. Because, of course, the two sides were daggers drawn, and eventually the nationalists had to flee to Taiwan, where, of course, they ended up, and Mao and his communists conquered the mainland and ruled from there. It became essentially politically impossible and undesirable for the communist authorities on the mainland to talk in anything more than quite stylized and minimal terms about the contribution to the anti-Japanese war of their old enemies. Until the 1980s and 90s, when that situation changed, a variety of reasons, the desire for reunification with Taiwan, a desire to also pressure Japan more in the world, particularly at the United Nations, and also the search for a new sort of patriotic nationalist narrative in the ideological smoking ruins of the Cultural Revolution, which had turned China upside down, been rejected even by the party itself as a grave ideological error, and then the search had to come for something else to try and bring people together. And that meant that new aspects, or rather old aspects of China's wartime experience, which had been forgotten, were brought to the fore to create stories which were often very much not manufactured in Beijing, but rather were from parts of China that felt they had slightly different stories to tell. So an example here. Sorry, I should have kept that. Never mind. We'll get back to that. In China's wartime capital, in the city of Chongqing in southwest China, known in the West as Chongqing at the time, essentially the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek continued to operate in exile between 1937 and 1946. It was constantly subjected to air raids. It's just one picture of what became a very regular scene, particularly in the spring and summer months when the fogs over the city had cleared and they were repeatedly bombed, particularly between 1938 and 41, by Japanese bombers. These scenes are very familiar in type to any British viewer, either those few left who lived through the Blitz and the many who grew up on children's stories, history books, documentaries on Channel 5 and the BBC as well, of course, Roger, about wartime, and the bombing of London, Belfast, Bristol, and other British cities. It is, I think, I was about to say it's often forgotten. I don't think it was ever actually very much remembered that Chongqing was there first, at least 2 years earlier. The first Allied city, if you want to use an anachronistic term, that was subject to Axis bombing, or first Allied capital, I should say, was Chongqing, and it's certainly remembered in China itself. This then went on. I mean, these events, that picture comes from 1941, I think, but we have the aftermath of this having been, as I say, not really talked about, because Chongqing was the nationalist capital, it wasn't the communist capital during the wartime years, and therefore under Mao, Chongqing's experience was really kept just to family stories, oral histories. You know, Granny would tell the children about what had happened. But in terms of the official stories, it was really very underplayed. Until the 1980s, when the narrative changed, for the reasons I've mentioned, and instead you would get TV documentaries like this one. I'm sure to Westerners in the audience, the buildings on the left-hand side are very familiar. The House of Parliament for London, Red Square, Moscow, US Capitol for the United States, and on the right-hand side, the anti-Japanese liberation monument in the center of Chongqing. I should explain for purposes of perspective that it is not in fact twice as high as the US Capitol building as presented here, which otherwise might have been, it would be rather more famous than it is. It's not actually, it doesn't exist in that version now. There's a rebuilt version, probably slightly higher than this amphitheatre. So impressive, but not quite as impressive as that. But the point being made here by this image and by this TV documentary is that there were not three great Allied capitals fighting fascism in World War II. There were four, and China should be counted as being one of them. But of course, the twist in this story from the Chinese domestic point of view is that this documentary, as you'll see from the middle, the bit that isn't in Chinese says CQTV. It's made by Chongqing Television, not by China's Central Television Network, and they are, slightly cheekily, but I think effectively, pushing the idea that actually it was the Chinese nationalist capital, their own city of Chongqing, which played this particular role. This is not a defiance of Beijing, because frankly, things that are defiant of Beijing do not get on television in China, but it is, I think, what I'd call it 90 degrees to the official version, which still sits very strongly in mainstream museums in China's capital, that the Chinese Communist Party should still be regarded as the leading force in the war against Japan. That isn't absent, of course, but here it is a somewhat different version of the narrative that's being put forward. That ambiguity, as well as desire for top-down control, also took its place in this much more top-down and mainstream event that commemorated the World War II experience. And just over, when it would have been, about 5.5 years ago, in September 2015, China, for the first time, held in Tiananmen Square, you see the Forbidden City right in the middle, for the first time, a major, huge, full-scale parade commemorating an event which was not in and of itself a direct commemoration of an event to do with the Chinese Communist Party and its history. They have quite a few parades, but pretty much every other one that I can think of anyway is about an anniversary of the founding of the state or an anniversary to do with the party's foundation. I'm sure there will be a big one this year for 100 years since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. But this one was VJ Day 70, 2015, 70 years since the ending of World War II. And it was notable that in the midst of what was an event very much dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, for obvious reasons, this is about as official as you can get, parade being surveyed by Xi Jinping, lots of interesting guests there. The American and French and British leaders declined to come, but Vladimir Putin, of course, was very much there, showing that there were new alliances being made, even though, of course, the embarrassing fact that the Soviets didn't enter the Asian War officially until the end of the last weeks in August 1945 was not mentioned, although, of course, the volunteer, semi-volunteer, not really volunteer, Soviet pilots who were there in 1937-38 did get a mention also. Beyond all that, something that was, again, less noticed but important was the presentation in the middle of the ceremony of veterans of the war, I think aged between 90 and 102 at that point, to Xi Jinping. Half of them from communist armies and half of them from the old nationalist armies. And that is something that is a change from what might have happened 30, even 20 years previously, and a sign that narratives, while they don't always move in the directions of more openness, quite often they can move in the other direction, have flexibility in China. Ideas of nationalism, whether they draw on war or history or any other source, can be changed, they can be opened up, they can be shut down. They are products of the propaganda desires of the Chinese Communist Party. There's no doubt about that, and that's what people tend to perceive. What is not always perceived is that the wider Chinese population, media sphere, social media, and just ordinary people living through their own family histories and experiences, don't always receive those messages in a pure top-down nationalistic way that involves a kind of monolithic understanding of what Chinese nationhood is. As shown by those Chongqing examples, it's perfectly possible for them to rethink the way that they want to understand a particular historical experience. I've given myself here the example of World War II, but beyond that, we could think of a whole variety of other experiences. There are also huge controversies today around the Cultural Revolution. It may seem anomalous, even bizarre, to many in this audience, but there is a considerable community, not least online, that wants to rehabilitate the Cultural Revolution as an experience that actually had some positive elements, including self-sacrifice and so forth, as part of it. I should add, I do not share that assessment myself, but it would be misleading of me to claim that it doesn't have a tremendous number of adherents on Chinese social media, and I would recommend Jude Blanchet's fantastic new book, The New Red Guards, which talks about it with detail and expertise that I do not claim to have. One or two quick examples. I want to go backwards, actually. I missed out I wanted to point out that as well as domestic politics, China, of course, is very much pushing forward the idea of itself as having a geopolitical role. And I think its aims, again, in a sense, are not particularly difficult to discern. China would like to be the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. It doesn't really recognize or think that the continued dominance of the United States as a power in the Western Pacific is something that it, if it were given its choice, would want to tolerate or permit. In service of that, it's clearly seeking to gain influence not just in the Asia-Pacific, but in the wider world, and particularly in the global south, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, all important sites of Chinese influence and growth. A lot of that, in the short term, comes from its economic role. I think everyone here has heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, a very baggy and wide-shaped sort of entity that can include an awful lot of both real estate and initiatives that can change over time, but essentially a strategy of investment based in small part on donations and aid, but actually far more on the creation of new loans and credit through some often, frankly, somewhat opaque investment vehicles to various parts of the world. And as with everything else, anyone who tells you either that this is an unalloyed evil which is destroying the third world, or that it's an unalloyed good that is bringing joy and sunshine where the West refuses to provide, is telling you an overly simplistic story about something much more complex in terms of Beijing's changing role as an international financier. The point here is that it is an absolutely clear manifestation of a global ambition about which China is now very clear. And all of this goes to serve this wider purpose of 综合国力, comprehensive national power, a term both bland in a sense, but also illustrative, since China's made it very clear that in both terms, in terms of power and in terms of security, the term antian, which has become a real catchphrase in recent years, everything from economic power to military power to cultural power are part of that wider matrix that it wants to put together. And if I may turn to World War II and its aftermath again, let me just give you a quick example of how those different factors might come together. So going beyond that, here is an event, and again, one that I think is familiar to at least the historians in the audience, perhaps not the best remembered conference of World War II between the major leaders. Late November 1943, the Cairo Conference discussing the aims of the Allied powers in Asia after the war would have been completed. But in symbolic terms, very, very important indeed. You have, of course, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill sitting there, and flanked on either side by Chiang Kai-shek and the, frankly, redoubtable Madame Chiang Kai-shek on the other side, who I persist in believing is actually probably one of the two single most powerful women in global politics in the early 20th century, the other being Eleanor Roosevelt, largely because actually competition for that title is extremely limited. And if in the Q&A people want to come up with alternative answers, I'll be happy to hear them. But in terms of ability to input to real decisions that made a difference to millions of people, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sung Mei-ling, I think has a really strong claim. So this conference was one that, in terms of the overall wartime strategy, may not have made all that much difference in the end, although the symbolism of a Chinese leader sitting with the US president and the Prime Minister of the British Empire was not lost on anyone, I think. But at the end, a communique was issued with some, as is always the case with the best sort of historical documents, wording that was sufficiently specific, but also sufficiently general to enable a whole generation of international lawyers and historians to quarrel about what exactly it meant. And in discussion about a series of islands that were at that point under the possession of the Japanese Empire, the communique says that they're going to be handed back to the Republic of China. So that's another kind of trigger in the mechanism, since the Republic of China means something rather different now than it did then, in terms of the restoration of those islands. The bottom line is that there are a set of islands uninhabited halfway between China and Japan. Japan, known as Senkaku, in China, known as Diaoyu, and these islands are disputed. The Chinese claim them under the terms of the Cairo Conference communique. Japan says that they are Japanese territory, and there's no dispute about that. But what I think is interesting is that certainly from the 70th anniversary of the conference in the year 2013, Chinese media went in really hard and continued to go really hard in a concerted effort along with Chinese diplomats to argue that actually this Cairo communique made a legal claim on the islands on behalf of China, incidentally, by the way, acknowledging, without actually openly saying so, that therefore the claims of Chiang Kai-shek should be regarded as a legitimate continuity of the claims of today's People's Republic of China, and that therefore the islands should be handed over, which I should add they have not at this point been, although I'm looking at Professor Bharat Kushner, who is much more up to date with the Japanese maritime scene than I would claim to be. I mentioned before this idea of spreading these ideas through all aspects of society. So, you know, the use of these diplomatic documents has been pushed by Chinese historians, by Chinese foreign policy thinkers, by Chinese diplomats operating at international level. But it doesn't end there. You also get a movie made about it as well, in which this actually not bad movie, Kailo Shenyuan, the Kine Declaration, makes a sort of fictionalized big budget blockbuster version of the conference. As you can see, it's it's narratively slightly suspect, since Chairman Mao, there in the middle, was not actually in Cairo at this point, but in Yan'an, up in northwest China. Joseph Stalin obviously was not there either, since he waited to the Tehran conference a few weeks later to actually show up, since the Soviet Union was neutral against Japan at this time. And I can say, having seen this movie, the actor who plays Winston Churchill actually has an American accent, which is possibly a tribute to his American mother, Jenny Jerome, possibly not. Nonetheless, this movie has a role as part of that kind of cultural matrix in which the presenting of these narratives of national pride, as well as narratives of claims on maritime and territorial disputes, is all part of that wider mixture. And as I say, in other aspects, you can't really understand, I think, the diplomacy or the lawfare side of things without understanding the popular culture side and how social media has affected these changes as well in China itself. Just one last example from this film, because I did find it so wonderful. At one point, the character playing President Roosevelt says, in English in fact at that point, that China should be given its claims because China is now a responsible great power. Now, anyone who's looked at China's recent diplomacy will know that this was a phrase of particular usage in the early 2000s, Fuzheran, the Daguo, inspired actually by the American Bob Zoellick, but then taken on board by, I think, Zheng Bijian and other Chinese foreign policy thinkers. The point is that if anyone can find anywhere where President Roosevelt ever talked about China being a responsible great power in those terms, I would like to see it. But certainly in terms of reflecting the political agendas of the early 2000s, it was a useful phrase to put in his mouth at that particular stage. Let me take a few more minutes now to turn to a different aspect of one of those strands that I think shapes the way in which China is reforming itself and where it's likely to head to. And this is separate from the idea of modern history. This draws more on the idea of the traditional philosophy, you might say. To explain what I mean by that, one of the things that has seemed in some ways anomalous is the growth of interest, very much officially encouraged, in China of Confucianism in that very broad sense, as a way of thinking about ethics and social cohesion in China today. And at one level, I think that that is not surprising, because if you look at the way in which China itself, through its policy think tanks, through its statements, characterizes the problems that it sees before itself, they are all problems of inequality, they are problems of growing downsides to constant growth. They are things, in other words, that threaten to split society apart rather than bring it together. And in that sense, they are products, actually, also of the DNA matrix that I mentioned before. You know, consumerism helps to grow the economy. It's very much at the heart of China's new idea of the so-called dual circulation strategy. But also consumerism brings along with it huge numbers of environmental problems that clearly are of grave concern to any Chinese citizen. The plurality of China's individual choices on economics, being able to set up your own business, being able to go to college, being able to go overseas to study, these are all real parts of the changes that have come as part of China's engagement with the world, as well as with economic change, but they sit in a more difficult way with the A factor, the authoritarianism, which is still very much about top-down control, at least within the borders of China itself. And technology, of course, is both enabling in terms of making China, you know, the most wired, big society on earth when it comes to paying with your phone, but also one that enables all sorts of levels of control when it comes to the gathering of big data, with very few, if any, privacy provisions made. Not none, to be fair, but certainly not types that a liberal society will understand. These are all, in those good Marxist terms, contradictions that have not yet been resolved. And in that context, the return of an idea of a sort of rehashed Confucianism in which harmony, hierarchy, knowing your place, being able to observe social bonds in a kind of quite pre-modern sort of a way, are being brought out almost out of the cupboard to try and deal with a society which in some ways has lost many, many of those capacities. To give one example that's very poignant to the current moment, it's very hard to have the level of xiao, or filiality, as it's sometimes called, a very traditional Confucian value, in a society which, broadly speaking, for the last 40 years, has had no siblings because of the one-child policy. Now, it's not true that absolutely everyone couldn't have more than one child, but nonetheless, this is the commonality of experience for most Chinese. So a very modern phenomenon now being addressed through some of this language. And if we look very quickly to some of the factors that shape today's China, the growth in income inequality that comes from certainly growing economy, but also lots of social dislocation, migrant labour, and the inability of people with the wrong residence permit from the countryside to get full social welfare and pension rights in cities that they may be moving to for construction, other work. These are problems that actually the Chinese Communist Party is quite open about acknowledging that it hasn't really managed to resolve. The countryside, more than 50% of China is counted as living in the cities today, which is one of the fastest processes of urbanization in world history, but nearly half of China's population, therefore, does not live in the cities. And concern about what's called the new countryside, which looks a lot like the old countryside in certain ways, but with more Wi-Fi, is one of the other issues that the party has very explicitly tried to deal with in the 5-year plan, because it knows that, once again, divides are huge. I think, last time I checked, the difference overall between rural and urban incomes was, or rather urban to rural incomes, was on a factor of about 3 to 1. I mean, this is a huge disparity, particularly in a country where moving from one place to another, country to city, is much more regulated by internal permits than in most other societies at that income level. It's also a society which demands levels of individualism within the consumerist society. Those of you who know Chinese TV, I know it sounds like I spent all my time watching Chinese TV, but honestly there's a lot of it out there, and actually some of it's really quite good. This is not good. This is talent singing contest, mostly with people who are, these people are fine actually, but some others do not have quite the vocal talent that these people have. Nonetheless, the idea of expressing yourself individually on a national or a regional or provincial singing contest is not one of the things that I think that the Red Guards in Tiananmen Square during the Cultural Revolution would ever have thought of. They were much more into communal singing, it has to be said, mostly about Chairman Mao. Now we have people doing covers of various karaoke-style pop songs. That's a very different sort of individual aspiration for the party to have to manage. And again, goes back to where do you find the balance between the consumerism, the technology that enables this, and the authoritarianism. Technology, as I've said, China has become immensely wired and it's thrusting ahead in 5G in all sorts of ways. This provides both opportunities for certain types of economic freedom. It provides opportunities for global spread, particularly in terms of setting down technologies that then set past dependency for other countries. But it also, of course, gives the state tremendous powers. And above, I almost say above all else, that's not quite fair to say, but I think it is fair to say that environment, climate change, and desertification are amongst the things that really, really keep the Chinese leadership up at night. I would love to tell you that freedoms in Hong Kong and the lack thereof keep them up at night, but I'm afraid I really don't think they do. I think it's scenes like this that are really at the heart of what they have to say. So, as we begin to come to the end, as Xi Jinping said 2.5 hours into his speech, no, but as I really do, I would like to, I think, summarize with two sets of factors about why China's rise, I think, has gained momentum. Because I don't think it's a chimera. I don't think it's something that's simply been done by underhand techniques and that the West has had a fast one pulled on it. But also, why China has slipped or is slipping and is in some ways undermining its own position. So let's start with that. Actually, let me get a bit more. There. That's something you need for the new auditorium, Roger, a water holder here. I think that'll be the next innovation. Right. So, first set of concluding thoughts. Why China has gained momentum. And here are narratives, here are stories that I think that China likes to tell about itself, but which I think are not without substance. First is poverty reduction. Now, you could make the, I think, factual and possibly cynical argument that one of the reasons that poverty reduction in China has gone so fast is that the same Communist Party made them so poor in the first place to begin with. But I think that while there's something to that, it's by no means the whole story. And it would be churlish not to acknowledge that economic and political reforms of a sort that are really very, very unusual in global history have created an enormous growth in overall wealth over a period of 40 years. China now has a per capita income of about $10,000 per year. India, it's about, I think, 3,800, certainly significantly less than China. And for that reason, if no other, the Chinese economic model is seen, not least by China, as having exemplar value for other societies in a similar situation. The second point is tech innovation. I still think it is true, and people who actually know about this, unlike me, assure me that it is true, that in terms of first-level innovation, Silicon Valley is still right at the front by a long way, and everyone else is nowhere. But when you come to really powerful second-level innovation, China is not the only place it's happening. It's happening in South Korea, it's happening in Japan, it's happening in Israel. But it's happening in the UK, actually. It's well worth noting that. We sometimes don't stress that enough. But it is definitely happening in China on a very wide scale. It's happening in Shenzhen, it's happening in Hangzhou, it's happening up in Haidian, near where some of the great Chinese universities are. And is one of the reasons why the science superpower status of China in certain areas, particular types of AI, such as machine learning, potentially quantum computing, and biotech, which in the era of vaccines is no small thing. These are all areas where China, yes, has, I'm going to find the tactful way since we're being recorded, appropriated without attribution various types of intellectual property. I think that is not in dispute. But it's also developed a very great deal itself as well, and that shouldn't be underplayed. The Belt and Road Initiative, we can have the debate in a different forum, perhaps in the Q&A of this one, about whether or not the Belt and Road Initiative really is all it's cracked up to be, and I've heard powerful views on all sides. But there's no doubt in many instances it has increased goodwill towards China in many parts of the global south. If you get on the metro in Addis Ababa, then you are getting on a Chinese-made, somewhat Chinese-paid metro, which gets you to work faster, and that is a real tangible difference that people, justifiably or not, attribute to the influence of Chinese investment and capital. In our current COVID moment, the health Silk Road, it's been called, has led to a vaccine rollout in the global south. The story, as I speak to you in June 2021, is about whether Chinese vaccines are nearly as effective as they ought to be. And there's some sign that perhaps in places like the Seychelles, they haven't been. Let me just put a different point to you. Would you be willing to bet your bottom renminbi that in a year's time, China's vaccines won't be as effective as the rest from around the world? China has a really strong, long record of getting first tries at things very wrong. It also has a really good record about learning from its mistakes and working out in the fields of technology how to make things work really quite effectively. The environmental role, I mean, again, as China points out over and over again, it wasn't China that left the Paris Accord in 2017, and although there are many things we can and should say about how much of China's climate change stance is rhetoric and how much is reality, the idea that none of it, including in areas such as development of green technologies, has any value, I think is far too simplistic. And finally, again, many people in the liberal world, for good reason, complain about the major role that China has in the United Nations. I would say there's one simple way to push back. Let the West pay more. At the moment, China is the second biggest payer of UN dues. And again, if administrations in the West withdraw or refuse to take part in UN agencies, it's hardly surprising if Beijing fills the gap. But I do have to add, and this is in the end where China's story about itself always leaves a lot out of the narrative, so we need to put it in here, all the things that are holding China back. First of all, it may be argued, and I've heard it argued by many, that Hong Kong has gained peace and security through this passing of its national security law. I think it is undisputable. It has also lost a very great many of the freedoms in media, in public protest, and in academia that have made Hong Kong a very special and unusual place. It is much easier to destroy something very fragile like that than it is to create it, and at the moment it does appear that it is slipping away, perhaps, I was going to say slowly, steadily, I think it's fair to say, in the wrong direction. There's also no doubt that Xinjiang and the establishment of so-called re-education camps in which very large numbers of Chinese citizens who are Uyghurs, and I put it that way because they are all citizens of the People's Republic of China with the rights that the Constitution gives them. They are not some sort of separate group of foreigners. They are Chinese citizens. There is no doubt that their treatment has achieved around the world a level of pushback and of criticism and of huge controversy for China that was entirely of its own making. On transparency on COVID-19, again, the question is raging, and to some extent, I think, is actually covering, for no particular reason. I think if it turned out that the origins of COVID were not as we thought, that wouldn't necessarily discount China's ability or indeed favorability in spreading vaccines. So again, it's another sort of self-created problem in that sense. The wolf warrior diplomacy, this very confrontational diplomacy that China is deploying around the world. Interesting that just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, as I speak to you now, Xi Jinping himself made a speech saying it was time to make China more lovable in the wider world. Well, I have to say, at least one friend of mine dearly loves wolves, actually, and thinks they're some of the most noble and wonderful creatures in the world. Not everyone necessarily agrees, so I think something that moves away from the wolf to a different sort of animal, I think will be much welcome. And finally, but I think in the end probably most instrumentally, in my DNA model that I started with, the authoritarian strand is becoming stronger and stronger. And I think that this would give me the thought that, in the end, a great deal of what is holding China back in its aims of being influential in the world are nothing to do with the United States or the West. Because in the end, I don't think the West either wants or really has the capacity to change China's system from within. The fear put forward by China is that the West is trying to subvert China and make it into a democracy. I don't think it is particularly. But whether it wants to or not, it's up to China to present itself and its own system in a way that the rest of the world can engage with. And so far, it's only done a partial job at best on that. So my final thought there, as I put up, when confused by modern China, and goodness knows we all get confused, I tend to look to my DNA points that I've mentioned, understanding it as simultaneously authoritarian and consumerist and global and technological, and understanding how these factors play together and will continue to play together, I think, through the 2020s and beyond into the next decade, is an important reminder of the complexity that shapes modern China, and that without knowledge and without understanding that complexity, we are not going to engage with a country with which we in the liberal West can and should disagree on many, many occasions, but which we have to come to terms with if we are going to have a world that will work for all of us. Roger, I think I've spoken long enough. Thank you very much indeed for having me here tonight. Thank you.
Rana, thank you. I'm mainly here as a timekeeper, I think. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'll ask people to keep questions short and one question per person, please, not composite ones, so that we get as much opportunity for plenty of people to ask. I also apologise, Janet, David and others who are sitting in the very middle. We haven't got a toy with which I look forward to playing eventually, which is a soft microphone which we can pass about as if it's been passing a rugby ball to reach those people. And because we're streaming, we won't be able to take questions from the very middle of the room. Front and sides, we will have some roving microphones, but then we sanitise them and so forth. So apologies to some of you who may have questions but are in the wrong seat. Sorry about that.
I think the Communist Party does that with the National Congress, with awkward delegates.
If they don't, I hope they'll acknowledge my
they're learning from Selma.
idea. Thank you. So, we are open for questions. Please. We've got a mic coming your way.
I'll break the ice. So thank you, Rana. Very interesting, and you've given us a wonderful map about which to think concerning modern China. I wonder if you can look at it from the Chinese side toward the West. You've told us how to kind of understand China. Is there something, can you give us your views on how China's understanding of the West has changed over the same time period, and how that might educate us as well?
Thank you, Barack. I think that's a really important question, and I have to say that the brief answer that I'll give is a slightly pessimistic one from our point of view, on the grounds that I think there has been a growing sense, particularly amongst middle-class people in China, who I have to confess tend to be the Chinese I talk to most, that actually, while they respect many things about the West, not least great universities like Cambridge, the belief that in some ways the West systematically has got things right is much weaker than it was perhaps 20 years or so ago. I think there were a few things that really flipped that switch. One was the great financial crisis of 2008, when essentially the international neoliberal economic system appeared to come to a juddering halt, and China took, well, I was going to say China took a different path. In fact, what China did was to basically create lots of Keynesian-style credit and spend it in a situation where it could. But there was something to the argument that they did something different from what Washington would have wanted them to do. Beyond that, I think also the failure of Western and particularly American foreign policy in the Middle East is a lesson that was actually repeated and is taught certainly in China's military colleges very extensively as an example of how not to carry out your goals overseas. And I think beyond that, there has been, because as a function of the fact that information about the West is widely known in China, but it is filtered, it is unfortunately the most negative side of what happens here that tends to get through to that social media public in China. And in that sense, it's also a kind of growing sense that, well, if the West doesn't like us very much, then we're not going to like them. Now, there are mitigations to that, not least, I think the fact that something like 100,000 Chinese students study in the UK, and I personally think that we should, keep that number high and increase it. It's a very, very important bridge at the moment between the two societies. But the fact is that the vast majority, I think, of that social media sphere has become very wary of believing that the West has some kind of nostrum that can be sold to China to solve China's problems. And that, I think, is different compared to, say, the late 1990s or the early 2000s, where there was more of a feeling that way.
We had one or two questions sent in advance from people who are listening in the streamed way. And sure. If those who've sent the questions in will forgive me for conflating their questions, and to borrow a phrase from old Soviet and Russian terminology, they focus on the near abroad and Chinese intentions or likely behaviours, whether across the South China Sea, whether with regard to Hong Kong, whether with regard to the Republic of China, Taiwan, and what the prospects may be looking forward in those sorts of places close to the People's Republic?
Yeah, I mean, I think each of those is a slightly different set of questions, and obviously for limited time, I won't go into each one of them individually. I think the Taiwan question is, in one sense, one of the most pressing and potentially problematic issues in China's self-definition today. Not, I think, actually for the reason that you sometimes get in the slightly more sensationalist newspapers, because I think actually the prospect of a military invasion of Taiwan anytime soon for a whole variety of strategic reasons is not an immediate prospect, and there are all sorts of preparations that would be visible and have to be made before that could happen. The prospect of economic boycotts and other pressures that could be placed on Taiwan, particularly in economic terms, is probably more realistic. But there's actually a sort of existential problem. I put this actually to Chinese diplomats before, and always got slightly kind of vague answers in return, which is, what is it that the PRC is offering to Taiwan as the sort of incentive towards reunification? Because the statement is always coming that we must have this because Beijing wants it. But then we push to, well, what is it that's in it for Taiwan? This almost comes as a sort of, well, it's something that we want, and it's the last unfinished business of the Cold War. The answer is usually given in the sort of slightly vague economic terms, and we'll give them more economic opportunities. But that, of course, creates the same fallacy that people have made towards China, and China's felt deeply insulted by the idea that if you basically hand people lots of money, they'll do what you want, and China wouldn't expect that of itself, I think. So in this particular case, I think the inability to come up with a narrative that in some way is coherent about what it is that China intends for Taiwan, and since the counter-narrative, of course, is Hong Kong, the basis of which essentially Taiwan won her re-election a couple of years ago. Today Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan. Beijing really has its work cut out, and so far I haven't seen any terribly effective answers on their part as to what their answer is to that very, very sharp question. More broadly than that, I think it's fair to say that in areas like Southeast Asia, there is a real kind of struggle going on. I mean, not a military struggle, thankfully, although the South China Sea has elements of that sometimes, but a struggle for influence in terms of countries that know that economically their fates are very heavily tied towards China being by far the biggest economy in the region, although Japan, of course, comes a close second in Asian, not close second, but a second in Asian terms. But also the understanding that losing the US security umbrella would be a very dangerous position to be in. They want to essentially be in a bilateral world, but they also want to have the advantages of both of them, a huge economy to trade with and a huge security presence to protect them, without actually having to choose between those contradictions. And how long that position is sustainable, not entirely clear.
Thank you. Got one more. You got your hand up first. And I think you're close enough to be away from the middle.
Go on.
Hi. I was wondering, there have been a number of authors who've argued that China is posing the same kind of threat to the US that Britain posed to, that America posed to Britain at the later part of the 19th century, as Germany posed to Britain in the first half of the 20th century, and as Japan posed to the US not only in World War II, but also in its dizzying economic rise till the 90s. Do you think these threats are overplayed? And if so, what should the US do about it?
A really good question, and in about sort of 90 seconds or so, I wish I could give you all the answers to it. As a historian, I think I'm allowed to say that while I love historical analogy, and I've used one or two of them in my time, they can conceal as much as they reveal. And I think the comparisons would say Wilhelmine Germany are not always as powerful as they might be. Not least because the nature of empires competing with each other, particularly over territory, is not, I think, the best cognate with what's going on. I think the South China Sea and immediate, very near abroad, are slightly different for other reasons to do with China's own perception of its history. But beyond that, in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, I think there is no doubt that China wants huge amounts of economic influence, and I think a certain amount of strategic influence as well. But it's not seeking to do so, I think, in the classic sense of either territorial invasion, or even actually, I think its version of elite capture, to use a phrase, is very different from the idea of the old Soviet Union, which essentially would find people's governments and then place them in line there. I think in a weird way, China isn't, at some level, it's not interested enough in actually subverting societies in quite that sort of way. It wants them, I think, to act in a way that serves China's interests. But in the last resort, I think when any Chinese top leader, I mean, speaking the whole time as if I know what they do when they get up in the morning, and I promise I have no personal insight into this, but my guess is that in the end, even now, when they're getting up in the morning and thinking what worries them, a top leader in Beijing is far more concerned even now to find out what the party secretary of Hunan or Henan is doing and stopping him doing it, because it's almost always a him, unless I'm wondering about what the president of El Salvador or what the prime minister of Malaysia is doing. That's important, but I think it's a function of the first. In the end, the concentration of China's interests will be domestic, and I think that drives an awful lot of these other factors as well.
This is where I have to be party pooper in chief and say we're running out of time for questions, and I also have some thank yous to say. Before that, a little bit of bureaucratic top-downness. If those of you on my left, when you leave, could leave by the door over there, and those who are on the right, leave by the door over there, and picking on those in the middle again, if you wait till everyone else has left, that will enhance social distancing. Thank you. I'm also very glad that for reasons of not being able to stand up for very long without hurting, I asked to sit down to do this because it means I don't have a handheld microphone and therefore will not remind anyone of one of your slides. I also congratulate you, thank you as well for not breaking our lectern on its first use by throwing mortar all over it. I'm very, very grateful.
I do have a track record on these things, so you are very lucky.
But more seriously, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating insight into such a timely and topical and important subject. As an Americanist, I'd note, of course, that part of Kennan's subversion of Marxist-Leninist doctrine was that he emphasized that communism was doomed because of its contradictions. And it was interesting to hear you using that term in regard, and your slightly more downbeat slide right at the end, perhaps echoing something that is often lost of Kennan's analysis. It was clear, it was insightful, it was important. You've given us, I think, a tremendous insight into the mindset and worldview, both of the leaders and, importantly, of a broader spectrum of contemporary Chinese thinking. You've reminded us that not everything, even in an authoritarian society, always comes from the top downwards, which is a crucial insight, I think. So thank you very much indeed, Rana. It's been great to have you here, and we are very grateful to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. It's been a real pleasure, and such a pleasure to speak to a live audience as well, which I hope we'll all be enjoying in months to come. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do have drinks, if you please know. They're going to be served on old board.
Thank you so much, Steve.
I
think your ultimate conclusion is so important in terms of ensuring both the challenge and connectivity